So this discussion is really essential, particularly now. I think most of us will recognise that we need to shift views on this topic and move the country to a better place on thinking about how we improve housing in this country. How do we make sure more people have the home that they need? How do we support people with their housing and also campaign for change? Is it time now to think about housing as a human right in a way that it hasn't been before? Good afternoon. Thank you very much for attending this session. My name is Chris Wood. I'm an assistant director at the housing charity Shelter. I'm really glad to be chairing this session. I think we all know how crucial a topic affordable housing across the UK is. I mean, for decades, not enough has been done to ensure people have fit housing across the UK. And all of that has been made worse by the coronavirus, not just in the UK, but across the world. In England, there's now hundreds of thousands of people who've gone into rent arrears since the beginning of the pandemic, 322,000 at our last estimate. So we've got some really good international speakers on this to hear from international examples on what they might mean for the UK and other countries to think about affordable housing and how we can view housing as a human right. First, we've got Balakrishnan Rajagopal, the UN Special Rapporteur on adequate housing. And then we'll have Dr. Orna Rosenfeld, who's a global housing advisor and research scientist, and is the current advisor for the European Investment Bank. And then finally, Christian Schantl, who's the head of international relations at Vienna Community Housing. Okay, so first over to Balakrishnan.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome to all of you. Let me just correct a little bit that my official title is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing. Affordability is one of the many elements that go to make housing as a human right. So therefore, of course, affordable housing is a critical part of my work. Now, housing, of course, is a human right under international law and has long been recognized as a right under international law. And as an international legal rule, it has long been binding on the United Kingdom. Of course, domestically, UK legal system has not translated that right into a legally binding right yet. I want to start by noting with appreciation the substantive response of the UK government to my public call for inputs into my report to the UN General Assembly, which is forthcoming, on COVID-19 and the right to housing. In that, I have called attention with appreciation to some measures taken by the government during the pandemic to reduce homelessness and rough sleeping. I also note the prior communication between the UK government and my predecessor on the issue of fire safety concerns raised after the Grenfell Tower fire and the issue of cladding safety. As a result, there is a process of open and constructive communication between my office and the government of the UK. Nevertheless, I also continue to receive communications from many civil society organizations in the United Kingdom, which raise serious concerns about the extent to which housing is in fact protected as a human right. And I agree with Chris's opening line that it needs to happen soon and, much more robustly. If we take the cladding issue, safety issue, for example, the measures taken by the government, including the recent Building Safety Bill and the funds announced to provide support for removal of cladding from certain buildings, either do not appear to go far enough or have loopholes or have not been implemented, although it has been 3 years since the Grenfell fire. My broad concerns about the protection of right to housing in the UK are several, and I will mention 3 of them. First, there is the question of inequality. And Chris opened with that. The UK is seeing deepening inequalities between property owners and renters, which should not be a major issue from a housing access point of view as long as renters' rights are adequately protected, but they are not. I will come to that. But the housing system appears to maintain and generate wealth for the already wealthy. There are approximately 8.7 million adult renters in the UK, 4.5 million of which rent from private landlords. 66% of the residents in Great Britain own homes, while 34% rent or live rent-free, according to the Office of National Statistics. The bottom 40% of households have zero housing wealth, which, as I said, should not matter if the rights of renters are better protected. The right to housing here critically has an element of uh, uh, both non-discrimination as well as equal access, which matter for equal provision of housing. Inequality in the provision of housing is incompatible with housing as a human right. It creates a structural barrier which weakens and blocks access to housing as a human right in practice. Secondly, my second concern is, as I said, with the question of renters, the lack of affordable, safe, and secure housing for renters, which appears to be a serious concern in the United Kingdom. Even in the pre-pandemic times in 2019, for example, there are already 8.4 million people, or 1 in 7 people in England, living in unaffordable, insecure, or unsuitable homes. Many millions were living in overcrowded homes. Many others are unable to afford their rent or mortgages. Many others are in what are called hidden households that they can't afford to move out of, including house shares, adults living in with their parents, or people living with an ex-partner. 1.7 million are in unsuitable housing, such as older people stuck in homes they can't get around, and families in properties which have no outside space, which is a critical issue during COVID-19, asking for social distancing. 1.4 million are in poor quality homes, and several hundreds of thousands are either homeless or at risk of homelessness. Social housing waiting list is too long. 43% of all renters could afford to live decently only if they were in social housing, nearly double the number on the government's social housing waiting list. Then there are the issues concerning fire safety after Grenfell, as I mentioned already. Thirdly, my concerns revolve around the question of security of tenure in the context of eviction threats and weak renters' rights. As seen around the world, COVID-19 has at once exacerbated and lifted the veil on UK housing crisis, as it has on the housing crisis in many other countries. An estimated 230,000 renters risk eviction and homelessness when the ban expires, according to some estimates. An estimated 227,000 adult private renters in England have fallen into rental arrears since the start of the pandemic as of June, and 174,000 are already being threatened with eviction. Now, of course, I note that the government issued an initial eviction ban in England and Wales in March as lockdown measures were put in place, which were effective for 3 months. The ban has been subsequently extended in August, and then, of course, now until September 20th. I also note with appreciation that under Schedule 29 of the Coronavirus Act of 2020, the government changed the minimum notice period for most tenants facing eviction. The amendment on August 29th with restrictions to termination of tenancies has been changed by extending the mandatory notice period under the Act for both what are called Section 8 and Section 21 notices after August 29th. And I note that with appreciation that it is now 6 months in most cases. When the eviction ban is lifted, though, the court system allows for automatic eviction of tenants who accrue rent arrears of 8 or more weeks, as well as the so-called no-fault evictions under Section 21. To me, what concerns me there is the no possibility for judges to weigh the impact of COVID when hearing possession cases. There are major health issues thanks to COVID, including mental anxiety and other issues. And judges should have the ability to consider those as factors while deciding the questions of eviction and eviction notices. Unfortunately, it is my impression that the law doesn't quite allow that or doesn't open the door far enough there. Thus, the government has taken some measures to curb evictions, including a ban on evictions and the extension of notice periods for eviction on most grounds. But the measures enacted thus far seem not to go towards offering longer-term relief for evictions, as well as more structurally dealing with the homelessness issue. This is something I warned about when I put out a call for a global moratorium on evictions during the pandemic and asked governments to sort of go with that for now. We are living through a pandemic now. In the context of the pandemic, housing advocates in the US, UK have called on the government to do many other things, such as suspension of rent, perhaps, or cancel rent beyond a particular percentage, or enact a permanent evictions ban, or introduce more robust rent control, or abolish migration checks on renters. There are so many good proposals that are floating around, and those and other permanent measures to protect renters' rights and prevent a wave of evictions and homelessness must be enacted and implemented, hopefully, by the government. I support the call of the civil society organizations in UK to push for more far-reaching changes that will go towards protecting right to housing as a human right. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Balakrishnan. And yes, absolutely, lots of concern about what could happen at the end of the eviction ban, as well as lots of organisations pushing for much more change across private renting and across social housing across the country. So next on to Dr. Orna Rosenfeld.
Thank you, Chris. Delighted to be here. I'm pleased to join the colleagues from Vienna and Boston on this specific session. I would like to add to this conversation something more about the housing continuum, and mainly a broader view on the housing market. And this is only just to kind of sparkle discussion about what the next challenges may be, and what are the issues that we will have to tackle as the result of the pandemic in medium and long term. I would look at the emerging trends and challenges in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on the housing system in high-income economies. This is a study that is in process. I would then briefly look at the recommendations that are coming up right now in the international arena among international institutions, and then move on to discuss with you the opportunity for transformation and building inclusive urban futures in the after COVID. So I would just like to add a little bit of statistic on what the Special Rapporteur on Housing has already mentioned in the context of the UK. If we are looking at the statistics in the EU, UK, US, Australia, what we can see is that several governments have implemented short-term responses during the COVID lockdown. These included suspending evictions in 11 EU countries, including the UK, taking care of providing emergency shelters for the homeless in 7 EU countries and the UK. Taking care of the renters has been one of the key concerns in 9 EU countries that implemented in different combination the following short-term responses. This is extending rental contracts, freezing rental increases, subsidizing rent payments, and reducing rent. But by far the most popular, as it were, intervention was one of forbearing mortgages. 13 EU countries, UK, US, and Australia have implemented this move, supporting the homeowners through the crisis. We have had other short-term measures, such as supporting mortgage payments, construction sector, and so on. As we move through the crisis, and short-term measures begin to be phased out slowly, I think it is important to look at some of the trends in construction, employment, investment, production, and consumption of housing to just kind of start to think about what medium and a long-term solution might be. So people and housing. COVID-19, I believe, has brought decades of housing policy achievements globally into a limelight and throw into a stark relief their weaknesses and failures. Housing need, as we all know, has increased after the global financial crisis. We have seen that 80 million people in EU and the UK are housing cost overburdened, spending 40% of their income on housing. And these are some of the statistical categories that came up in terms of the people who are facing housing challenges in terms of lack of housing affordability, lack of access to housing, and so on and so forth. And in this sense, the COVID-19 has only laid bare the economic and housing inequalities that we already have. Of course, the COVID-19 affects us all, but the pressure is not evenly distributed among all people and all places. So I think it's worth of looking at the projections of future employment at this moment. We're 4 months out of the confinement. These are very interesting statistics from the OECD coming on the possible employments depending on scenarios, health scenarios of development of COVID. In next year or so. So what is quite interesting to see is that 30% of people in the OECD countries holding low-paying jobs have lost their jobs in comparison to only 14% of the high-income people in the same countries. So if we are looking back at this 30%, there are three groups that seem to be affected disproportionately, and these are women and low-paid workers, part-time, temporary, self-employed workers, and young people. And here I would just like to support you on this point, Chris, as well, that as in the UK, in Europe and in other high-income countries, there is a concern that the pandemic would plunge the COVID-19 generations, those people who are under 25, into a dark age of declining social mobility because of the rising economic and educational inequalities. And actually, the housing inequalities can actually cement these inequalities in space in our country, in different territories. So construction sector, as we all know, has been heavily impacted by the crisis, although there have been differences between countries, as the graph here shows. Current data suggests that activity is expanding, but from a very low level. We see delays, continuing distancing requirements that are needed in construction sites, disrupted supply chains. In many countries, it will take some time until before the residential construction reaches the pre-COVID-19. In countries where the construction has been heavily impacted, like here in France, the concern is that the backlog that we have seen, the shortage of housing, will be basically this new delay will add to the current and existing shortages, and therefore worsen access to affordable housing in the future. Of course, on the positive note, there are thoughts about developing the sector in terms of making it more digitalized, using more prefabrication, moving toward environmentally friendly construction. But this will take time, especially considering the state the industry is in right now. The story that is contrasting to that one of the construction is the one of PropTech, or property technology. The property technology has advanced during this crisis, during confinement. The practices that have been experimental just at the beginning of this year are now becoming accepted and mainstream. This is a list of some of the new property technology solutions that are really becoming a mainstream, including the closing process digitalization, virtual tours, expansion of the short-term property management platforms, and more. I think that there are 2 points that I would like to emphasize here. These practices are likely to make the consumption, the international consumption and investment in residential real estate easier. So that it's important that as we go through this, the examination of what is going on in this sector, to look for those companies that are providing positive social impact in the housing markets, in addition to commercial benefit that they may secure. I think that it's very interesting to look at, and especially in comparison to previous crises, the data from US, France, Spain suggests that the long-term lasting effects on home prices may be very limited on national scales. But the price differentiation may play out differently in different submarkets. And that raises questions about the future of territorial development. We see here the example from Spain, where different regions basically respond differently in terms of price, depending on the share of the population that was infected by COVID-19. Global and capital cities showed moderate slowdown in housing price increase to limited and change. Here, there is a warning again, as in the UK, of development of two-tier property sector in which those with insecure jobs or small deposits find it very hard or harder than ever to afford or access home. We have mortgage rules that are tightening right now, and that is actually pushing many people into the rental sector. So just to give a short overview, we have a construction industry that was hit hard with reduced supply in short term, prop tech that is advancing housing prices that seem to be not as challenged as in the previous crisis, employment that is decreasing, and what concerns us all is increasing inequality if we do nothing. So here I would like to give a very, very quick and short overview of the recommendations that are coming out up now in the international arena. My team and I have been surveying recommendations provided by different international organizations in this moment to see what are the key trends, what is the discourse, where is the discourse moving. So the short-term measures related to housing, as well as universal transfers to businesses and individuals, were of course welcome. But the discussion today revolves around the manner and keeping or phasing out of these interventions and their potential longer-term policy trades-off. Clearly, these measures and their combination differed between countries and within the countries, but there are two main takeaways from my perspective on the short-term measures. First is that these rapid-fire and static housing policies and intervention implicitly acknowledged some of the long-term structural deficits of housing systems around the world. And second, clearly, they show the ability, power, and decisiveness of the governments to effectively intervene in housing systems and housing markets. So this is, I think, something this is the momentum to actually build upon when looking at longer-term and medium-term solutions. Now, I would like to move on to some of the very, very clear, broad messages that are coming out from this discussion and recommendations, policy papers on international level. So there is a very rich policy discussion about the future in the view of the COVID and after COVID. Sustainability has become a leitmotif of recovery. Of different strategies at regional, national, and international level. One also senses a widespread of expectation that the pandemic legacy must include lasting environmental and social benefits. But what we can also sense in discussion and in the discourse is a traditional bipartisan divide on matters of the intervention in markets in general and housing markets in particular. And this discussion, as we know, it takes some time. Thinking forward, in medium term, has been very interesting to look at, if looking at the discussion on the international arena right now, is increasing and raising consensus about one point, and that is investment in social and affordable housing. That has not been a time before where different international organizations, governments, some of them, especially here highlighting investors, and as well as cities, were on this point together. And I think that this consensus in this time of uncertainty, this point that brings us all together, is something worth building on now. Of course, one can think about many solutions and recommendations, but I believe that in times of uncertainty, having a point that brings us together, a platform around which we can collaborate, is very important, because we're just 4 months out of the confinement. So we are in plein crise. We are really in the midst of crisis, and I think that this is a very, very positive development. Hand in hand with this, joint interest in investment in social and affordable housing is, of course, renovation of existing housing stock to make it more environmentally and climate friendly. So I think that this is the good time, actually, to give the microphone to my colleague in Vienna. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Orna. And yes, a sort of positive note to think about what we might be able to do next, although obviously very worrying to see how the crisis has been affecting those on the lowest incomes and insecure housing, sort of speeding up the issues that were already there, I guess, across many countries. Over to Christian.
Thank you very much for inviting me once again to UK Housing and the possibility to present the Viennese model of affordable housing to you. Besides economic aspects, for every person living and thus a roof over their heads is an indispensable basic need. In this context, the housing property has some special features. Housing is location bound, has high construction and maintenance cost, and is individually planned. Due to the immobility, longevity, and uniqueness of housing, this property cannot be substituted. The problem of allocation, on the one hand, the basic need for housing, and on the other hand, the scarcity of affordable housing, justifies state intervention. Since demand cannot be adequately met by the free market alone. Active housing policy, and thus the appropriate housing supply, is therefore an important economic and socio-political challenge, which must be fulfilled by the welfare state. Next slide, please. In Austria, welfare state housing policy has a long history and is based on the housing shortage experiences at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Nowadays, we have various legal frameworks to ensure affordable housing. They don't just focus on social welfare and the fight against poverty. Rather, the system is designed in a way so that almost all social groups in our society can benefit from it. This is achieved, among other things, through the Limited Profit Housing Act, the Tenancy Act, and the Viennese Housing Promotion and Renovation Act. The origin and basic understanding of Austria's housing policy is that housing is seen as a basic need. That is why state intervention is seen necessary in order to ensure that it is not completely left to free market mechanisms. The establishment of a broad segment of subsidized apartments outside the private market ensures that not only low-income households have access to subsidized apartments, but also the middle class. The focus is not on welfare for the homeless, but on achieving a social mix in all residential areas. The Viennese Housing Promotion and Renovation Act is a central element of social housing construction in Austria. This not only promotes the construction of new housing, but also ensures the preservation of existing buildings through renovation. Thus, the buildings can be brought up to the latest technological standards and adapted to the current needs of the residents. On the other hand, the subject subsidy is intended especially for people with low income or in financial distress. Aid for housing is paid out for subsidized or renovated apartments, as well as for unsubsidized private rental apartments. It's an individual support of the city of Vienna to reduce the current burdens, and also depends on the maximum income, family, and housing size. The Limited Profit Housing Act provides the framework for all limited profit construction associations, whether organized as a cooperative or as a corporation. It defines not only the principle of the public good status, but also other topics such as the handling of rents and the purchase option or membership of the supervisory association. The Austrian Tenancy Act is a very strong housing policy instrument, which serves above all to protect the tenants. However, the law is very complex as it defines very different areas of application depending on the time of construction of the building, age of the lease, and type of the construction subsidy. Therefore, divided into full application, partial application, and full exception segments. Next slide, please. Now, why do non- or limited profit companies voluntarily give up their profits? Here, the historical development of social housing construction in Austria is crucial. In the aftermath of great housing shortages, the first limited profit cooperatives formed to provide housing. After the two world wars, there was an increasing consensus that housing is a basic need and ensuring affordable housing is part of politics in the Austrian welfare state. For this purpose, the state grants subsidies, which can be used mainly by limited profit developers so that affordable rents and private ownership is ensured. In order to be recognized as a limited profit property developer, the principles defined in the Limited Profit Housing Act must be complied with, including profit restrictions. However, by being recognized as a limited profit construction association, the limited profit organizations have tax advantages that private real estate developers do not have. For example, the earned profits of limited profit developers are generally exempt from tax. So-called reserved capital is subject to taxation after 2 to 3 years. Therefore, the capital must be reinvested. Only a small part of the generated profits may be distributed to the shareholders, up to a maximum of 3.5% of the capital stock. The remaining earnings of the limited profit cooperatives or companies remain in the company as equity capital. This is reinvested for housing purposes, for example, for the land stock, the interim financing of new construction and renovation, and for approximately 10% of the ongoing construction cost. As mentioned above, these profits are mostly exempt from corporate income tax. Next slide, please. Residents of limited profit rental apartments have several advantages. Probably most important are the lower rents as compared to the private sector. In comparison, the net rent for new leases in the promoted sector is 6.4 British pound per square meter and month, around 23% below the level of private landlords. Here we have rents at an average of 8.4 British pounds per square meter and month. Another advantage is the quality of the offered apartments. The statutory provisions established the new buildings in a uniform, consistent standard of high quality. Almost a third of the subsidized residential buildings are under 30 years old and have a very high energy standard. This results in low energy costs for heating and water. The combination of housing construction promotion and limited profit housing construction in the Austrian system of subsidy is dampening the price increase of housing costs. It's therefore partly responsible for the fact that housing expenditure in Austria accounts 21.3% of household consumption expenditure, around 2.5% below EU average. In addition to the stable rental prices, the mostly indefinite tenancies are a great advantage. 96% of all subsidized leases are concluded for indefinite duration. This gives the residents planning security for the future. So the overall effects of affordable housing in Vienna are a good social mix, less problems with speculation and gentrification, the upgrading of neighborhoods, and better preconditions for smooth living and working together in our city. Next slide, please. Nowadays, Vienna, the capital of Austria, is home to 1.9 million inhabitants. Next slide. Today, more than 50% of all Viennese live in subsidized apartments, either in one of the 220,000 municipal housing apartments or in one of the 200,000 cooperative apartments built with city subsidies. Next slide, please. As mentioned, we see housing as a basic human right. That is why Vienna invests each year about 320 million British pounds in housing construction and restoration of older buildings. Another 88 million pounds are given to individuals who are unable to afford even subsidized rents. The subsidies are financed from federal taxes and through the general income tax system. This funding through taxation creates a reliable basis for the planning of complex housing programs, which would be impossible under strictly market-dependent housing policies. Next slide, please. Now, for sure, money is a key issue in building up affordable housing. Besides the already mentioned legal frameworks, another key factor for affordable housing in our city was established with the Vienna Land Distribution and Urban Renewal Fund in 1984 to provide land for state-subsidized housing construction and to supervise the restoration of old houses. As a non-profit organization, this so-called Wohn für Wien coordinates property developers, house owners, municipal departments, and service centers of the municipality of Vienna. At the moment, Wohn für Wien holds land reserves to the extent of approximately 3.2 million square meters. Recent years have seen land and real estate prices in many European cities, in Vienna too, spiraling out of control. To counteract this development, the city of Vienna amended its building code in November 2018 by introducing the subsidized housing zoning category. If land is thus classified as belonging to the subsidized housing zoning category, 2/3 of the usable floor space created for housing purposes must, as a rule, be taken up by subsidized dwellings. This caps rents and safeguards that affordable homes will continue to be constructed across the entire city. In its turn, it ensures the desired good social mix all over Vienna. All these measures provide for an adequate supply of good housing in Vienna, as well in the rest of Austria. So ensuring a high quality of affordable living can only be done with constant commitment and a wealth of action. Thank you for your kind attention.
And of course, I think a lot of people recognise now there's a lot of lessons from countries like Austria where arguably kind of hugely better outputs are being achieved based on subsidising the supply of affordable housing, specifically social housing, which contrasts with countries like the UK where we're focusing on demand side measures rather than those supply side measures. And here it's things like the Help to Buy scheme. I think I saw some stats where that suggested we spend 9 times as much as Austria on our demand side subsidies, where Austria is spending that money on supply side subsidies, and so clearly not getting value for money there. Right. Well, look, thank you so much, everyone, for those really, really interesting presentations. And I think lots to pick up on, whether it be about security of housing, affordability of housing, what's happened since the coronavirus, and then also just specifically interesting, kind of looking at models in different countries and kind of what they might mean for the UK and whether they can really be used elsewhere. We've got a few questions already. Please do, if you want to ask a question, do type it in and I'll try and get through as many as I can. So one question is really, one of the questions we've got is really about the sort of topic of the title of the session, talking about a human right to housing. And kind of the regulatory framework needed for that. It's a particularly, I think I'll ask Balakrishnan and maybe others if they have any other thoughts on this, first on this. It's particularly about Grenfell Tower fire, but I want to widen it as well to sort of a rights-based and regulatory-based approach more broadly. So it's what does the panel think about the accountability gap in relation to Grenfell? So where there was a real feeling that kind of accountability was not claimed, or and responsibility was not seen as lying in the right places after the Grenfell Tower fire, and of course the domination of the unregulated, exempt and other types of accommodation sectors in the UK. I suppose this is just interesting, just thinking in terms of other examples across the world. I mean, is it possible for us to move towards a system where there are real rights to affordable or decent housing, where somebody has accountability for delivering those, or are we always going to end up in a situation where there isn't that accountability claimed by one party or the other? Certainly in Scotland, something that we're pursuing at Shelter, where there's a new human rights law being introduced. We're trying to get a human right to decent, affordable housing embedded within that law. But do the panel think that is possible? Are we ever going to get beyond these accountability gaps where there's no responsibility claimed? Can we get to a rights-based system? Shall I start with Balakrishnan?
Sure, happy to just make some brief remarks. Of course, I strongly believe that not only is a recognition of the right to housing as a framework possible, it's essential. And it is quite clear, especially listening to the remarks from Christian about Vienna's experience. And I'm thinking about other countries which have had, better success than UK in protecting right to housing. Singapore, for example, comes to mind. And so there are countries that have actually recognized right to housing legally, but have not made much progress, in fact. But then there are other countries that have not quite formally recognized right to housing in a legal sense, but have nevertheless treated housing as though it is a human right. So, of course, it's a complicated issue to simply say, if only governments formally recognize housing as a human right legally, things would change. But I will just confine my remarks to the UK because this conference is focused on UK. UK being a system that is based on a clear recognition of legal rights and duties, with so much emphasis on, the responsibilities of people that flow from law. It seems to me that recognizing right to housing as a legal right in the UK would actually potentially have a transformative effect on a number of different issues, including many issues that have been mentioned both by me and others, including the question of accountability. So one of the basic consequences of recognizing right to housing as a human right is that it immediately raises the question of duties or question of accountability. If someone has a right, then who has a duty to actually uphold that right? And in the context of the UK, where so many rights are actually assumed to vest, in the hands of, say, freeholders of property, that might actually provide a useful sort of rebalancing of rights between the rights of, say, renters and the rights of freeholders by, for example, better protecting tenure security, or better protecting the procedural rights. If a judge in the UK finds that housing is actually a human right that he or she needs to uphold, believe me, it's going to be a very different ballgame when it comes to procedurally how the courts are going to approach this whole issue. So I would strongly sort of encourage the government to consider this moment. As Orna was saying, this is a moment where we have seen that measures that seemed almost politically impossible to contemplate before the pandemic have been accepted temporarily by governments. They are offering support to mortgage payers and renters. They have stopped evictions. They've extended notice periods. It's almost like a recognition of the fact that, maybe we should have done something different even before the pandemic. But I would argue, as I did 4 months ago in an op-ed in the Washington Post, that the pandemic provides a great opportunity to recognize that governments are doing too little and they were too weak in protecting housing as a human right. Now is the time to take advantage of this moment to consolidate the measures that have been put in place temporarily and then to make many of them more permanent.
Thank you, Balakrishnan. That was really helpful. That was really good. I'm going to move on to other questions, but others on the panel, if you do want to pick up on anything that has been asked before, when you respond to other questions, do feel free to do so. So we've got one question here for Christian. You told us that over 50% of households in Vienna live in subsidized housing. Is this level welcomed and seen as a positive level of subsidized housing for the capital? A question as to sort of how that's perceived, I suppose. Is there a desire to do more, or is that seen as the right level?
It's seen as the right level because that's the level where the subsidized sector influences also the private market and dampens the prices on the private market, because this sector is so strong that it has influences the whole market. And that's one important factor. And what's specific for Vienna in special, and what divides Vienna, I think, from the UK a lot, is the factor that in Vienna, 75% of all of the whole population is living as tenants. So ownership is a very small sector in our market, and one reason for that is that you, as a tenant, have nearly the same rights as you would have as an owner. You even can inherit this apartment, apartment to your children, if you like. This makes this gives the people living in those apartments a great security.
And I think there's lots of research, and even more emerging research now, around the importance of stability actually in housing, what that can mean for people's life chances, for the communities they live in, the ability to put down roots, all that sort of thing. On the opposite side of the spectrum, one of the questions has raised the thousands of homeless children stuck tonight in unsuitable B&Bs and hostels. The person asking the question has directed this to Orna and Balakrishnan. What are your views on using good quality modular homes as temporary accommodations instead, while a long-term strategy takes place? The questioner is suggesting that this could be a better alternative and save money for councils. So I don't know if Orna, you want to take that first?
I don't think that I will take, but I would just like, before leaving the floor to the special rapporteur, I would like to mention something that is actually related to the previous discussion. And I think that what we are forgetting, that housing policies are not static policies. And I think that I would just go back and think about how the UK housing policy has developed after the Second World War in 1945. There was a different kind of system. This was a different kind of commitment to investment in development of social and affordable housing. There was more investment in construction, in supply. One of your ministers at the time, that was the Minister of Health and Construction, said, and as I quote, that UK should be building welfare systems up on the revolutionary idea that there is no point of establishing universal health service if the UK weren't also to establish a universal right to decent, spacious, and affordable, decent, spacious housing and fair environments. So I'm thinking, just to think about that, we are not in the static world of a housing policy. The housing policies change for different reasons. So this is just the point that I wanted to add to the previous discussion. So therefore, we have the liberty to change, and we have the liberty to look at some positive lessons from the past. And then I would like to give the floor to the special rapporteur on the point of homelessness.
Homelessness, I've said many times publicly, and I am arguing that in my forthcoming report to the GA, UN General Assembly as well, on COVID-19. Especially in the context of the pandemic, homelessness is a question of life and death. To be homeless is to basically be sentenced to die in a variety of different ways. And also, by the way, in the context of the pandemic, it's also potentially a super spreader event that could cause deaths for other people. So it's a very serious public health risk. In addition, of course, to being a gross violation of human rights, and specifically on the question of children, of course, goes without saying that as more vulnerable members of societies, children, of course, are more in need of having the condition of homelessness be eliminated as soon as possible by whatever measures are immediately available. And in that context, of course, modular homes are better than nothing. But of course, modular homes are not a permanent solution, nor are some of the measures that other governments have taken. For example, some governments here in the US have moved some families into motels and provided, vouchers to be used and so on and so forth. Those are good sort of temporary measures, but really are not going to be resolved. And there's always a question of where are they going to go once these measures actually run out of funds or come to an end eventually. So it all comes back to the broader issue of housing insecurity, which we've all been highlighting in a number of different ways, which is a structural problem and the vulnerability of many people who are renters. I was struck by Christine's remark about the percentage of people who are renters, which are 35% in Vienna. In the UK, according to the National Office of Statistics, 35% of renters are live rent-free, whereas the remaining are homeowners. The issue is twofold in the UK. One is that clearly the number of renters is not insignificant at all. It is quite significant, and it's been going up for a variety of different reasons. The second issue is the non-recognition of the rights of renters in a meaningful way, and the lack of enough protections for renters, which is a major issue that many housing rights groups have been arguing, which I strongly support.
Thank you, Balakrishnan. And yes, absolutely. So it's also worth kind of mentioning just the really unprecedented action that obviously the government took to bring all rough sleepers in, or at least rough sleepers known to charities, in off the streets at the start of the pandemic. Although I'm sure a lot of people will have recognized that some people are now falling through the gaps, and there's a kind of worry about what happens next for those people, as well as more people who might end up as rough sleepers or end up homeless during the pandemic and ongoing. So another question, which kind of picks up on a lot of what different people have spoken about, really. As we come to the end of the short-term measures that were put in place around the pandemic, are any of the speakers aware of any positive steps that are happening in other countries to deal with the medium-term impacts of the pandemic? I don't know who wants to go first. Orna, this is probably closest to what you were mentioning in your presentation, so you might have something on that.
I think that at the moment, the discussion is really about focused about to what extent should the short-term measures be extended, or when they should be phased out. I think we are here in France, for instance, we are 4 months out of the confinement, so this is quite immediate end of the crisis. So there is no, I would not say that there are any. As I would define the medium-term measures. What I see that could be done in medium term is to act upon this increasing consensus and discussions about really acting upon and really investing in social and affordable housing. This has not been implemented yet, of course. This is just something that is in discussions. But what is quite surprising in comparison to what was happening after the global financial crisis is that there are discussions that on this point that are kind of shared between the international organizations, and that was not really the case. This point was not mentioned before. This is also the issue that is quite new and interesting for investors. I think that JLL made a survey saying that 80% of their investors that they surveyed are interested in investing in live-in assets that cover actually affordable housing in Europe. And I think that this is something that where people can really come together to act upon in crisis. So I would not really go into the short-term measures, because in some countries, short-term measures that we see listed are still implemented. There's discussion of how long they should be implemented, where they should be phased out, and so on. So I would leave them in the short-term category. But I think that this is something that is quite clear. That we can unite around on international level and start working on. And there's lots of work to be done there. Obviously, everybody who is in the social housing sector and investment sector would know the knowledge gap between the two. Non-related to that one of the ability of the governments or willingness to really invest the capital in construction of social and affordable housing.
Thank you, Orna. Really important rallying cry there, I think, to tackle affordability by investing properly in the social housing we need across the country. And I'd probably add, don't just call things affordable, actually make them affordable rather than just adding that as a label. Just a bit of a plug, I suppose. Obviously, along with many other organisations, we at Shelter are campaigning for more social housing. I'm sure many others are working on similar things who are in attendance. But we can't do this alone, so please do share the message. Do help us, and you can join our campaign at shelter.org.uk. But in the meantime, thank you so much to Balakrishnan, Orna and Christian. It was really, really interesting, really useful presentations, and a fascinating discussion to follow, and much more work to be done, as you said, Orna. Thank you so much to all of you, and thank you everyone for joining this session. Thank you.
My home is where I want to grow old.
My home means everything to me.
My home is the heart of the family.
Home is beautifully designed.
My home is warm.
My home is where I feel safe.